Hi everyone, and welcome to the Mental Training Room. This is your host, Haley Herdman. I'm a former Division I basketball player and current mental health therapist.
And I am Naomi Yim, also a former Division I basketball player and a current real estate investor with a passion for athlete mental health.
Throughout our time as collegiate athletes, Naomi and I struggled with our emotional well-being, and we know from this experience how neglected the mental aspect of sports can be, which is why we created this podcast, to foster a safe space for other athletes to open up about their own experiences.
Whether you are an athlete, coach, parent, or anyone with an athlete in their circle, we hope you can gain some insight from our episodes that can help you along your journey. And the most important thing we hope you can take from our podcast is that you are never alone in your struggles.
Now, let's get into it. Welcome to the Mental Training Room. Welcome back to the Mental Training Room. Today we have Lisa Auld on the episode. Lisa is currently the Associate Athletic Director at the University of Southern California, USC, go Trojans. She works in student athlete development, and prior to this, she worked at University of Pittsburgh, where she correct me if I'm wrong, but got your start with working with student athletes. You served as the Assistant Athletic Director for Student Life. You were also an adjunct professor there and Director of Life Skills and a career consultant for student athletes, which is so awesome. Very, very rich background in working with student athletes. But before that, Lisa was in sales, I think, and worked with my dad. So that's how our paths crossed. And before all of that, Lisa got her BA from Villanova, and then she went on to get her master's to become a licensed professional counselor. So in addition to the work that you do with student athletes, Lisa is also a therapist, which is so awesome. Fellow therapist.
Yes.
But welcome to the Mental Training Room, Lisa. I'm so excited for our conversation today and all of the amazing information that we're about to dive into.
Me too. Thank you, Haley. I appreciate it.
Yes, of course. So Lisa's here today to talk to us about holistic athlete development. As I said, she's currently the Associate Athletic Director at USC, working within the student athlete development area. And before we get into everything we're about to get into, can you give us kind of a brief overview of what student athlete development is, and we can kind of go into how that field even emerged?
Yeah, absolutely. So back in, I guess, present day, people may know student athlete development, that terminology, and or often places it's still called life skills. But kind of to go back to the history a little bit, in the early 90s, the NCAA kind of put forth this mandate that all Division I universities needed to have some type of personal development and holistic support for their student athletes. So really focusing in on that like whole person development to accompany the athletic and academic work that the student athletes were already doing, as you know firsthand. So
Yes.
every Division I school now has some type of support in that way. Some departments are larger than others. And then I would say a fair amount of D2, D3 schools also have it in their athletic department. So in the early 90s, it was called Champs Life Skills. And then later on, after a few decades, they kind of renamed it Student Athlete Development. And so you'll hear it called either or. And then the other thing to mention, N4A, which is kind of the larger organization that houses professional development for academic advisors in the athletic space, combined to add student athlete development under that umbrella. So there's a lot of professional development that occurs with those two. And you'll find student athlete development either embedded in the academic side at a lot of universities or just sitting next to.
Okay. When you say embedded into the academic side, what does that mean?
So I've worked at two institutions now. During my time at Pitt, we were a separate department in academics through athletics, kind of routed through the provost office on campus, but we worked very closely with them. At USC, I fall kind of under the umbrella of academics, and I don't do any academic support, but we're in the midst now of kind of building out our own pillar.
Okay.
And truly, I've seen it both ways. Some smaller schools or smaller resource schools will also have an academic advisor that also does career development or something of that nature. So I think it honestly depends on kind of the university's alignment and the structure, and then also like the amount of resources the institution has in terms of how big the department is.
Yeah. Okay, that makes a lot of sense, because now when I'm thinking about it, see how it was definitely, for my experience, it was definitely within the academics and not its own separate department, like you were saying. So I see how that fits in, and how the academic advisors or counselors like really although they helped us with academics, I'm looking back and being like, oh, that was probably sort of a student athlete development, more in like that field rather than just the academic field.
Absolutely. And I would say at a lot of schools where I do see it embedded, there's much more of a career focus, as there should be. Like, that's a huge need. And that makes sense that academic advisors would take on some of that. Certainly there's schools that have career development and their own career counselor for student athletes. The other, I should mention, the other big piece that is typically under the umbrella of student athlete development is some focus on financial literacy, leadership development, and personal development. And then oftentimes you'll see community service in there too. So we can certainly go into those in detail if you want.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we move on from this movement that happened kind of in the 90s, I want to go back to the CHAMPS, what you said, and that stands for Challenging Athletes' Minds for Personal Success, which is really cool to see that. I mean, for me, that seems like a long time ago because I wasn't born. But
Oh, Haley, I know.
But I know it's not obviously that long ago, but to see that is, it has its roots and it's not a new thing that's starting up. And the goals of this CHAMPS program, or the life skills program, like you said, supporting student athletes in their intellectual development, preparing for success in life, meeting the changing needs of student athletes, which I'm sure is huge now too, promoting that respect for diversity, enhancing interpersonal relationships, and other things just like building positive self-esteem, making meaningful contributions to the community, promoting ownership of their academic careers, social responsibilities, and different like leadership skills, like you said. Are these all things that, like, is the CHAMPS program still in place at all these universities?
To some degree it is.
Okay.
I don't think, I'm not 100% on this, but most universities have gone away from the vernacular that is CHAMPS.
Okay.
So I would say now it's Pitt being a good example, and obviously I'm familiar with that based on my 12 years there, but we called it life skills, and that was the umbrella. And I will say we were really fortunate there that we had a generous donor, and so the whole program was called the Kathy and John Pelusi Family Life Skills Program. Before I got to SC, so about a decade at SC, they had named it personal development. So it was up to each school what they wanted to call it. And kind of under the umbrella of personal development at SC, that person also did career leadership and service. I've renamed it student athlete development just to kind of align with what the industry is calling it. Yeah. And I would say there's a white paper out from N4A with a lot of practitioners in the student athlete development world. And so when people are really interested in this field and doing a lot of research, typically you'll see it called student athlete development, and that's kind of evolved from that CHAMPS acronym.
I love the word or the term student athlete development because it just shows that there's more to being a student athlete than just school and your sport. And it shows that these young athletes, like it opens their eyes to so much more, which can be really hard in the moment, because I even remember meeting with like career advisors, I guess, from our university, but not just for athletics. Like it was open to the whole university, but we had like team meetings with them, and just thinking like, I'm so exhausted from practice, from school, from everything. Like the last thing I want to be thinking of right now is what I'm going to be doing in 3 years. But obviously being out of it, that is so important. And I did obviously pay attention in them, and it did help, but it's hard to be in the moment with that because of everything that's going on in your day to day. But I think it's great that student athlete development is becoming a more familiar term to people, because it's showing these athletes that there's more out there that we can focus on. And I think that's just really awesome.
I mean, you know this firsthand. I would say, and when I meet with recruits, obviously and I always say, like, the bulk of your time is spent academically and athletically. And the latest statistic I saw from the NCAA is that it's between 60 and 70 hours, right, that the average student athlete spends between athletics and academics.
Oh my gosh.
So that's like with the 40-hour a week kind of job framework that we've all grown up learning about. I mean, that's like a job and a half full time. So that third key component, which of course, right, as a therapist and someone who loves the personal growth side, is close to my heart, and I'm passionate about it. And I know that there's limited time and bandwidth. And so many other challenges with the changing landscape right now. But that third kind of key component of personal growth and development is where student athlete development comes in. And that might be, we do a ton of programming and services around transitioning that first year and or transfer into the university, and then a lot on transitioning out to whatever
Okay.
that might be, right?
Yeah.
Professionalizing in your sport, grad school,
Yeah.
volunteering career. But then there's certainly different pillars within the student athlete development program typically. Some schools focus more on them than others. And I would even say different sports focus on them, right? So
Okay.
we do team specific programming and or individualized services.
Yeah.
Because to your point, career is so individualized.
Yeah.
And what might work now could be totally different, right?
Yeah.
In a year or two.
Absolutely. Would you say that one of those pillars are mental health? Would that fall?
Yeah, for
Okay.
sure.
Okay.
Well, so interesting you brought that up. I would say there's not too many student athlete development programs that actually have the mental health clinicians embedded within that program.
Okay.
Although Cal, Dr. Marissa Nichols is awesome, and she developed a pretty unique program at Cal where she has one of her pillars as mental performance. And so mental skills training
Yeah.
falls under student athlete development at Cal. I think there's a few other places that have a similar approach. At Pitt, we had some of that mental skills training underneath of our leadership development pillar. But generally speaking, so mental health and wellness as a broad category and just kind
Right.
of like the overall wellness of student athletes is absolutely part of that mission of student athlete development. But I would say a lot of mental health clinicians, either that we're using at the university level and or that are embedded in athletics, typically fall under kind of the sports medicine umbrella. But
Okay.
there's so much collaboration, right? At SC, I collaborate with our sports psychology department quite often, right?
Yeah.
And actually have bi-weekly programming meetings to make sure we're aligned with, what the general themes are, what we need to increase education on, really making sure that as we get a pulse on what's important to the student athletes and the changing landscape, like what keeps coming up,
Right.
both proactively but also reactively.
Absolutely.
Something that's pretty cool that we can touch on more. My last few years at my prior institution, I partnered up with the mental health clinicians and we developed a 3-credit class for student athletes that proactively taught kind of DBT skills training. So that was really
That
awesome.
is amazing.
Yeah. And we ultimately saw a decrease
Wow.
in one-on-one services based on teaching these skills proactively.
Yeah. The time that this episode is released, we would have released an episode with Jenny Smith, who's actually my aunt, but she's a DBT therapist in Orange County. And we talked about in that episode just knowing being aware of what DBT is and those skills, how much that can, obviously I'm a huge fan of therapy and being in therapy, but sometimes as a student athlete, like there might not be time for those appointments, but to have a class that you're getting credit for and you're learning basically self-help tools, that is amazing.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, absolutely. And even now at SC, there's a 1-credit freshman athlete transition course, and we invite sports psych in to teach, and we focus a lot on tools that they can have, right,
Yep.
to regulate breathing, to talk about
Yes.
kind of how arousal and performance could link to trait and state anxiety, things like that. So,
Absolutely.
which, I know you know those terms well, and
Yeah.
certainly a lot of people think about, I'm sure, mental skills training for Division I athletes, professional athletes. Very much it's needed, and I would say widely adopted in a way that I didn't see it 10 years ago, and even open the door for more mental health and kind of just like normalizing mental health overall. So
Yeah.
sometimes sports psych gets you in the door, and then you can focus on life as well. But I certainly think that it's normalized and encouraged in a way that hasn't been in the past.
Definitely. And in January 2022, which was my senior year, my second semester senior year in college, I remember something being, I also being an athlete, and I wasn't even aware of all of these things that like the NCAA had in place, or that there was even like life skills development, which is, maybe it's just the university I was at, or maybe it's, I don't know, maybe other student athletes feel the same way of not really knowing like the systems that are in place that you can't really see. But I do remember this one in January 2022, there was kind of like a mental health movement within the NCAA. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was something about like schools have to facilitate an environment that kind of reinforces that like physical and mental well-being within their athletics by making sure that these student athletes had the appropriate resources to engage in to uplift their well-being. And I do remember that because since I was graduating, I already knew I was going to USC for my master's in marriage and family therapy. I was like, oh, this is great. Like, I know that this is a need, but it's so awesome to see that, again, the normalizing of it all. Like if NCAA is making a specific movement about it, it's definitely coming to people's attention. With that initiative, did you notice any changes within universities that they had to kind of adapt to?
In my two institutions, mental health was certainly prioritized and something that we discussed, right, on the administrative level. During my tenure at Pitt, we actually worked with the hospital system there, called UPMC, to embed two mental health clinicians into athletics, because previous to that, and that was prior to 2022, but I would say that was kind of the, upward projection and trend of mental health being prioritized at the university level and also at the national level. But prior to that, I would say it was the norm for most universities to utilize the counseling center. But even with that, most freshmen were coming into universities across the board, not just athletics, right, with a higher diagnosis rate than ever before. And I don't know the stats off the top of my head at this moment, but with that, counseling centers were saturated, and so I think that also helped make the move to either pinpointing a person at athletics that had, at the university level, that had additional athletics training that could be the liaison to athletes, or actually embedding clinicians into the athletic department. Still recognizing that all the confidentiality laws are still in place, and I talk to athletes now that might be concerned that if they do see someone throughout the athletic department in the mental health world, right, that it gets automatically translated to their coach, and that is not the case. Confidentiality laws are still in place. So I definitely have seen a more push, even from the conference level, whether that's Big Ten, ACC, SEC, of prioritizing mental health. And each school, I think, after that mandate from the NCAA, each school kind of had to attest to, we provide these services and we have a crisis plan in place. So SC has one of the largest sports psych programs in the country, and so I know that they had been always kind of, broadly speaking, meeting that requirement, and it was still nice to see the NCAA have that be a requirement for all schools.
Yeah, and even now I saw they're adding kind of a new part of that initiative. I think that will take place in August of this year. That's going to address more of the emerging information about the intersection of mental health, and including sports betting, social media, corruption in sport, suicide contagion, which is, for those of you who don't know, contagion is the definition is disease spread by close contact, but sometimes in this case, suicide contagion, meaning student athletes are seeing other student athletes die by suicide, and that kind of having a trickle-down effect, whether it's encouraging others to do it or it makes them be oh, this is how I'm supposed to cope, so kind of contagion in that sense. And then also implementing everything with NIL. And it said that this document is also including more specific details about student athletes of color, LGBTQ student athletes, international student athletes, and student athletes with disabilities. And I have that emphasis on international because now we're seeing all these student visas being revoked. And that makes me think of what if it was a student athlete? And I don't know if maybe there has been one that's happened already. I haven't seen anything, but this new kind of addendum to the mental health movement seems like it is touching base on a lot of very current and prevalent issues with student athletes. Do you know how that will kind of change the landscape for this, or anything that, again, universities will have to do to adapt to this?
I think if anything, it's really calling to the front. Here are some of the prevalent issues that are going on, specifically at the D1 level, but across college athletics. And if you don't yet have a plan in place, right, please dedicate services and or support to these particular groups. I like that it's being called out very deliberately, because I would say, generally speaking, all of those themes have come up throughout the years. Even more so, I know those groups that you mentioned are even groups that we've heard that, we're empowering them to use their voice to say we need additional support. Right, there's an added layer of challenge across many groups of the subset of that student athlete body, and really making sure that we are also supporting those student athletes with unique needs that the general student athlete might not need, whether you're international, transfer, LGBTQ, woman, etc., student of color, etc. The other thing I would say I would call out, and this is my potentially second time covering gambling in a really in-depth way, gambling education that is, every year staff and or student athletes, as you might remember, right, are kind of agreeing with the NCAA and signing off on, we agree not to bet and take place in any kind of monetary and or in-kind exchange for any sport that is an NCAA kind of varsity sport. we always talk about that, and I'm pretty sure most athletes are quite familiar with what they can and cannot do, right? Even a March Madness bracket,
Yeah.
regardless, at the pro level as
I
well.
remember before we went to Vegas for our conference tournament, our compliance person would always come in, give us a lecture, and then we would have to play like a Kahoot to make sure
Make sure you
that we
understood the
understood. I
role.
was like, I get it. I think I was like first place my senior year because it was the same one every year.
Yeah, yeah. You're like, I'm not even doing a bracket for fun,
Yeah.
right? It takes the fun out of it.
This episode is sponsored by PhysioWorks Physical Therapy. Sports aren't just about skill, it's about strength. And I'm not just talking about physical strength. Athletes train their bodies, push their limits, and build muscle to perform at their best. But what happens when injury strikes, or when movement just doesn't feel right? That's where PhysioWorks Physical Therapy comes in. PhysioWorks isn't just about recovery, it's about unlocking your full potential. Their expert team helps you rebuild strength, improve mobility, and prevent future injuries, so you can get back to doing what you love. At PhysioWorks Physical Therapy in Redondo Beach, California, they understand that true performance is both physical and mental. So whether you're rehabbing an injury or leveling up your game, don't just push through the pain. Work with the best, because a strong body fuels a strong mind. And when both are in sync, that's when you truly win.
What I will say has increased, and I think this will just continue to increase, especially with athletes being more and more, always have been featured on social media, but more and more prevalent with being paid for their name, image, likeness, is the prevalence of bullying and like gambling, in terms of so many of the hate messages that student athletes get on social media and other places from those who are, partaking in gambling across the states. And so really prioritizing the health and safety of our students in that way and educating them in that way. And it was pretty staggering to see how many student athletes have received these messages. And in some cases from, like grown adults that are threatening, right, some of these things. And so
That have never touched a basketball, soccer ball, whatever it is in their life.
Right. And it's scary, right? Because you don't know. And there have been, and I think in some cases, right, is gone completely through the legal process, and student athletes have gotten protection in that way. But really, the health and wellness and safety of the student athletes is the top priority. So getting them as much education, and also making sure that it's something they're aware of, that they're not potentially making a misstep in giving out information in a way that they don't realize could impact the game, or just answering a question from a fan and or a family member about like who's playing, who's injured. So really just, especially, right, because there's so much money on the line now in college athletics, in the business, but also for the student athletes. So I think we're right to provide more education around that. But ultimately, a lot of these things will continue to impact just how we're being proactive about supporting their mental health too. I agree with you on that. I do think NCAA still maintaining that this is a priority amongst everything else that's going on, to continue to push forward like the business side of athletics at the college level is still, the work that we do, the work that I do is like important in ensuring we're looking at this 18 to 22-year-old as a whole person.
Right.
What else goes on in their world besides just athletics?
Yeah. What you said about maybe accidentally giving out some information that would, hurt the team or program, whatever, it reminds me of Chloe Kitts, who's on South Carolina. Her and Coach Staley were in like a press conference, and she just had like a super great game. I think she had a double-double. The press was asking her some question about like, what was going through your mind? What was your team doing to help you? And she accidentally like said the name of the play and told the press and like everyone what the play was. And Coach Staley was like, well, thanks for giving out our play. And she was like, you could see her face get red. She was like so nervous. And that was just like a little funny note. But it does bring me to do within student development now, and this can kind of be a segue into what exactly you're doing at USC. So within student athlete development, do you see, and maybe it's already present, any like media training for these kids? Is that in that at all? Because that's what goes through my mind all the time, is like, I'm obviously wanting to sound like you know what you're talking about and knowing how to answer the question on the fly, but also having the kind of like press answer and not the fully authentic answer. Like, it makes me nervous when I see these kids doing it. Kids,
Well, no, it's hard
girls,
enough,
but
right, for all of us to be kind of in the spotlight and having a microphone in your face, and knowing that some of these student athletes are 18, 19, 20.
Right. That frontal lobe is not developed.
Right. I know, that is a great point. And I'm constantly impressed, right? Constantly impressed by the caliber of student athlete, how they're able to handle the pressure. But yes, to answer your question directly, I know that most of the teams have a dedicated and or shared like sports information director, and they're continually doing social media education and media training. Typically, like that absolutely could be part of the student athlete development umbrella, specifically bringing in like the professionals that do that. But ironically, I'm putting together a program now for summer programming for some of the teams that are on campus during the summer training,
Yeah.
doing classes, etc. And part of their professional development will be to embark on further media training. They're already getting some, but we're partnering with Annenberg School of Communication at
Oh,
SC,
that's so cool.
right, who they actually have a super cool program that started maybe 3 years ago with Fanatics, who does Michael Rubin is
Yeah.
really passionate also about the holistic development of the pro athletes. So they've already partnered with them on offering up additional kind of career and or life transition programming. And so I'm really looking at how to offer that in a way that meets the needs of college student athletes at the age they are. Not just media training, but planting the seed for transition and life after. Whether it's, first year out and or you do successfully play at the next level. And at some point that transition still comes, right? So getting those kind of planting those seeds now with the professionals like Annenberg School of Communication.
That's so cool. What other, because I know that you were brought to USC to kind of really build up this program. So what other things, programs, initiatives are you working on at USC, or have you already completed?
Yeah. Well, what I'll tell you is that I'm in year 2 at SC, and even in the few years that I've kind of had these conversations and, really been doing a lot of benchmarking across the country, looking at who's doing it well. What I will say is there's been so much change in the landscape in the last few years, and in particular
In the last month, too.
but no, it changes daily. Obviously, NIL had already started and kind of opened the doors for student athletes to make money off the name, image, likeness in a more direct way. And then we know some of the rev share, house settlement stuff is coming soon. So what I will say is,
Yeah, hopefully that's for the athletes that will get paid that graduated, right?
the house settlement
Or
part
is-
of it is,
yeah. Okay, I get some money from that, I think.
yeah. You might. There's a website. I'll give it to you after.
Yeah, no, I looked.
Did you
And
look?
I was like, my total, I was like, yes. And then I have a friend who's in the NBA and he played at Texas A&M and he showed me his. I was like, oh.
Yeah. I know. I've seen some really like awesome numbers, and other people that are like, I don't know where this came
Yeah.
from. And I know people that have missed it for like by a year because
Oh,
it's 10 years
no.
out, right? 10
Yeah.
years out. And like I understand that there is a legal reason that it only goes
Yeah.
back 10 years, of which I couldn't tell you
Yeah.
details of, right? But they are out there online about a case. But no, what I want to say is I think it's changing, and we are, just yesterday, right, I had a meeting with my colleagues at the Big Ten and the other institutions through the Big Ten. And one of the focal points was really talking about how we're addressing and or pivoting to support what the new landscape looks like while still knowing we don't know exactly what the new landscape looks like. So I say all that to say, like, the pillars that we talked about initially and what they are at SC under student athlete development is leadership development, personal development, career, and financial literacy. Those will continue. What I could see happening, right, is continuing to refocus in on, in particular, financial literacy, right? That's something that arguably, like, all of us need increased skills around. It's really about giving skill building, planting the seed. That's something else that I think, it's so individualized, even the way we approach handling our own finances, but really looking at how we can kind of broadly educate student athletes, particularly when quite a few of these sports, will likely make even more money based on rev share and based on NIL. So making sure that we can give them education and resources
Yeah.
to set them up for success long term. And having said that, many student athletes are even now coming to school with representation, marketing agents and financial advisors in a way that they weren't even 5 years ago, and so a few years ago. So I think that that's really important on us to know that that's an area that will need increased in some way. And honestly, I'm still figuring out, does it become a model where it's team by team, right? And it's curated for that particular team's culture and or challenges. And then even from there, in the past, we've done a lot of programming for your first year, your senior year. And I still think that continues. But, it's also about resources and figuring out what we have the bandwidth for, and then also what the student athletes have the bandwidth for, right? There's very limited time, and we understand that there's so many demands, firsthand on student athletes. So how can we still prioritize and at least get them some information and resources to make sure they're set up for success?
Yeah. And I'm sure the financial literacy is huge because obviously NIL and the income that these athletes are making individually, and a lot of them maybe, that they're not used to having that much money either. So that's not something that they could learn from family members, parents, siblings, because they're the first generation that's really bringing in this wealth for their family. And knowing how to invest it, how to spend it right, what to save. It's really cool to see that they're building wealth, but also giving back, because I think that's something that, they're given a platform and they're not just using it for their own gain and their personal needs, but showing that there's other people out there too that we could be advocating for, or that we could be providing financially for, or donating to. Elite athletes know performance isn't just about what you do in the game. It's about how you prepare and how you recover. That's why today's episode is brought to you by Defend USA. If you want to stay in peak shape, you can't afford to ignore the power of recovery. That's where Defend USA comes in. Trusted by the NBA, WNBA, MLB, NCAA, and beyond, Defend USA's compression gear is designed to help you train harder, recover faster, and perform at your best. Their military-grade compression technology boosts circulation, reduces muscle fatigue, and helps prevent injury, so you can push limits without breaking down. That's why the best athletes don't just train hard, they recover smarter. Level up your recovery, level up your game. Check out Defend USA at dfndusa.com and at dfndusa on Instagram, and get the gear trusted by the pros, because true champions don't just train hard, they recover harder.
Individual student athletes really be able, regardless of the team they're on and or their playing time, right? You don't have to be the superstar to get these brand deals. So if you're really crafty and creative when it comes to your own branding, social media or otherwise, right? It could be doing autographs at a car dealership. So I do think it opens the door in a way that hasn't been before, which is pretty cool to see. And it's making sure, like, from start to finish, are we providing education and services around, if you wanted to do it on social media, right? And we're in LA, so, there's probably an extra heavy dose of content creation available than there might be somewhere else. But all the way through, like, how does this impact you as a person, right? Is this, or you're getting a lot of money, what are the tax implications of that in a way that you haven't had to pay taxes before? So certainly, we can't, there's so much education that we could give and resources that we do try to support with. And also keeping in mind that I know, again, going back to kind of full circle, the bulk of their time is dedicated to that academic and athletic pursuit at the moment. And so, being there to support them, coming down to like creating those relationships and knowing that they do have a support system around them, regardless of what happens on the field, the court, the bowl, that we're there to support them in that way.
Yeah. You said from start to finish, and that makes me wonder, how are you building your program, or how in general is student development going to be affected by all of the transfers? Because I feel like it's going to be very rare now to see an athlete start and finish at one university. And I can see how, we see it on the talking to different coaches of it plays with the culture. But then also I see on your side how also the culture of student development and wanting to make sure, if you do create a curriculum, like, okay, if it's a 4-year curriculum, but a student transfers after a year, then, so how are you taking that into consideration?
Yeah. I mean, that is one of the questions right now.
Yeah.
And I appreciate your insight on it. I was recently talking, right, to our leadership staff around how do we support transfers, and is there something we could be doing, again, through my lens, which is student athlete development and or curriculum. How could that look different, or how do we add an extra layer of support there? I agree with you, and I can't speak from the coach's perspective, but we do see the challenges, whether it's culture and or just continuity. Like certainly I've worked with transfers in the past few years to try to continue to create a sense of belonging in community, which is typically what we hear when a transfer will come in and say it kind of it was a minute before they got their feet on the ground and felt supported. So there's people that do a great job of creating that sense of belonging and community, and in particular looking at how we can support transfers in that way. But even from a sheer like educational perspective, some of the foundational things we might do for incoming first years that we don't know what's happening at the school they came from. I think that, you know, what ultimately will happen is that it's going to be a lot more individualized and curated for, yes, teams, potentially individuals. It will really just depend on the amount of staff and support staff that will be available to support that team, that person, etc. And throughout it all, we know that athletics has become, in some ways, a concierge service for athletes, and that's what we're there to do, right? To support them. And there's so many resources at the university level, too, that are always there to collaborate with us and support us in a broader way. So I don't know that answer, but I agree with you. Well, I mean, I agree with you that it's like, change is hard for anyone, let alone people that are transferring 1+ times, like multiple times. And so it depends on what their ultimate goal is too, and how we can be there, be an influence, kind of guide them with what they need at the moment. Long gone are the days of, I used to hand out a 4-year plan.
Right.
50
Gosh.
years ago, and say like, and if you happen to do a 5th year, right? And that has certainly changed, even with that COVID 6th year. So that's not as clean as it used to be, and we know that. But even with that, people were coming in at different levels too, right? People required different levels of support when they came in, depending on what they were exposed to and what they needed in that moment.
Yeah.
So really, one of my supervisors and mentors at a previous job used to always say, just kind of, we really are trying to meet you where you are, right? And that's kind of the philosophy that I try to go forward with is like, ideally, in theory, it might look like this, but when in application, we're going to meet you where you are.
Yeah. And I'm sure that's easy for you too, with your therapy background. I feel like that's one of the biggest things that they just tell therapists is like, at the end of the day, you just have to meet the client where they're at. Seeing how that's applicable to what you're doing at USC right now too, and just in the student athlete development world in general. And yeah, I'm sure the transferring situation is disrupting a lot on so many different levels. And it's interesting to hear your insight and how you're kind of noticing those effects when you're developing this new program. Well, everything that we talked about today was so insightful. I loved learning about all of this. And I think the biggest thing and the biggest word that kept popping up and kept speaking to me too was the word holistic. And the holistic athlete is something that I'm very passionate about. It's why I went into the marriage and family therapy route instead of going straight into sports psychology, because I wanted to get that background of, that psychodynamic type of orientation where you're looking at the athlete as one part of like a huge system, whether it's a family system, where they went to school, where they grew up, if it's generational trauma that they're dealing with, or systemic racism, or any other systems that are in place around them that they might not be aware of, and really looking at it holistically. And then also on a more maybe surface level of like, okay, what else do you do besides play your sport? Like bringing in those aspects of the human experience. So that's why I went the MFT route, to be able to bring that into sports and when working with athletes on the mental side of the game. And then combining obviously the education of sports psychology, my experience, and all of that good stuff. But with that being said, it sounds like the student athlete development and what you're focusing on is really that holistic development of athletes. And kind of to wrap it up here, why do you think holistic development is so important for student athletes?
I mean, we're all multifaceted people, right? No one thing defines us. I've seen sports psych do a really effective exercise where you're kind of doing this mind mapping exercise and putting all of the different descriptors of who you are. And what we generally see is if athlete is at the center of that, you have a much harder time transitioning. Right, and even just being someone who, yes, that might be your full exclusive focus, and you are performing well athletically. But generally speaking, someone who's like the most well-adjusted and ready to transition now or later into life after sport is someone who kind of has that core identity with athlete as one key piece of the pie. Right, there's so many other things that we do and are passionate about, and I would say, at the Division I level, that is a challenge, is that we are, and some people are better at this than others, just depending on what their outside interests are, how much time they have to curate them and cultivate those, but really kind of talking about other things that you see that you get your worth self-efficacy, right, self-esteem from, that improve your overall self-worth, so that we're not, making it harder on ourselves and have that kind of whole athletic identity foreclosure piece. So, which is a huge part of it when that's been your life for since whatever age. So I think holistic in the sense of we're supporting you as a full person, and I think it also directly ties to like your worth isn't determined by how good or bad you did on the field, on the court, right? And as someone who's prioritizing the person, that is really important to me, to know that their worth isn't directly tied to that. So I'm right along with you. One of the things that I always push and believe about mental health is that like mental health is health. We often see it written and or we talk about it as like your mental health and your physical health, but you can't be healthy without having positive mental health. So mental health is health, and it's part of the whole picture, just as kind of holistic development and looking at you as a whole person is.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love the way that you just said all of that. And it's super important for all student athletes to remember that aspect that you said, that athlete is just a piece of the pie. It might be maybe a bigger piece than the other ones, but knowing that you have more to you than just the sport that you play. And whether, even if you're really good at the sport, like it's still great to find other pieces of yourself to become really in touch with yourself, with the world around you. And yeah, I think everything that you just said was so insightful and so inspiring. And I just want to thank you for your time today and for sharing all your knowledge with me.
Excited to see what comes next.
And that's a wrap for today's session in the mental training room. If you found value in this episode, make sure to subscribe to our show, share it with a teammate, friend, parent, or anyone you think would benefit from listening, and follow us on Instagram at mtr.
We'll catch you next time inside the mental training room. If you are currently experiencing a mental health crisis, please dial 988 for emergency support.